Big things coming here in 2025. The Your Story Matters podcast is launching an exciting new lineup of special guest episodes to inspire and empower trauma survivors on their healing journey. Be sure to check out Micro Matters, a new series of micro podcasts offering quick, heartfelt insights to help you navigate your journey for recovery. These bite-sized episodes are designed to encourage and remind you that healing happens because your story matters. Stay tuned for an incredible year ahead, right here on the Your Story Matters podcast. Now, let's jump inside today's episode. Hope you enjoy. Hey, survivors of abuse and friends, welcome back to another edition of the Micro Matters episodes here on the Your Story Matters podcast. I'm Branon Dempsey, and today we're going to be introducing a brand new series entitled Reclaiming Your Emotional Freedom. So, when we talk about reclaiming our emotional freedom, Branon, what do we mean about that? Well, I'm not going to be talking about the voices in your head, but rather, we're going to be talking about the anxieties that we feel in our heads, in our bodies, in our whole system, and how can we deal with that instead of it dealing with us. So today's episode is called The Power of Naming Anxiety, how labeling your anxiety and the emotional overload helps you regain control. Come on, people. Now, I will say I had a little bit of anxiety before I did this podcast because there's so much to talk about. And I listened to my friend on the phone talking about what he was going through. And then we got into this conversation about, so if we just name it, we just name the anxiety, right? We have a better handle on reality. But you know what? It's so easier said than done, right? Because when you hear things like this, you're like, oh yeah, come on, Branon. I mean, how can I really just let this go or not think about it? Well, you know what? I'm not ever telling you to let it go or to not think about it because that's almost inhumanly possible. I cannot let go of the hurt and pain that I went through, but I can manage it. I can't forget all the bad things that have happened to me, but I can process it. See, there's another way around it in dealing with our emotions than what we think. Because it's not about just cutting things off and never having any association to do with it again. That's what we were taught. When we were younger, we were told to not have feelings, right? Oh, well, why are you getting upset? Well, you shouldn't be sad. This should not make you angry. All these different voices in our heads that came from people that maybe we've looked up to. They were our caretakers. Or most of all, they were our parents or other leaders of authority. And we carry this baggage into our lives as adults, not realizing that we're shutting off our own emotions and our own feelings based upon what somebody said years and decades ago. So, this is where we come down to talking about anxiety. And the reason why this prompted me to write this series is because when my friend and I were speaking on the phone, I was encouraging him by saying, it's almost inhuman for us to say, we feel it in the moment, right? I shouldn't be feeling this right now. I shouldn't be going through this right now. I don't need to have this kind of anger right now. And see, the more that we do that, the more we're causing our own anxiety, right? So the more I say, I don't want to be anxious. I shouldn't be anxious. I don't want to feel anxious. Do you see what's happening? I'm already anxious, and I'm making it worse. Last night, my boys and I watched Inside Out 2. If you know anything about the movie, it's about a 13-year-old girl who finds herself in the struggle of puberty, where all these racing thoughts and emotions and anxieties take place, and you see the characters that are in her brain and her emotions just go haywire. And there's an evil character in there that's not really evil, but they play the adversary, which is called anxiety, right? And it is just putting this girl backwards and forward into her own teenage life. And so when you look at movies like this, in some ways you have to laugh at it because it's entertaining, it's comical, but it's very, very true. And so just like the little character that we see, or characters that we've seen in the movie, they also infiltrate us into real life. And this is when we're talking about anxiety, or the little character's anxiety, or the little agents of anxiety. Anxiety can surge into our lives, sometimes quietly, other times with overwhelming force. And the thing I hate about anxiety, which most people do, is that it can hijack your thoughts. It can dictate your reactions. And then it leaves you feeling powerless, because it's like, oh gosh, if I just didn't have this overwhelming feeling that's just, it feels like it's controlling everything I do. Well, let's back this up. Anxiety is not a little person inside your head pushing buttons and pulling switches and toggle, I don't know, whatever. But it's actually an emotion. And so I want to ask you the question, what if I told you that one of the most effective ways to manage anxiety and emotional distress is just simply to name it? No, it's not to cast out the little character inside your head, and it's not to have this victorious moment of you standing over it saying, hey, I proclaimed over my anxiety. Well, we want to get to that point, and I think that's actually a pretty cool illustration, right? But there's a beauty about naming and identifying our emotions, because it is an essential step in emotional regulation. At least that's what we call it in therapy. It also helps us in trauma recovery. And for those of you who follow a lot of my posts on Threads and YouTube, narcissistic abuse. It is wonderful of how to have this tool to help you deal with narcissism. By recognizing what we're feeling, now this relates to any kind of anxiety. Whether you're taking a test, you got a job performance review coming up, or something's going on with a quirky family member, or a you-know-what kind of family member, or anybody. By recognizing what we're feeling, we can reclaim our power from that chaos. And instead of it, the key point is that instead of letting the emotions control you, you learn how to control it by understanding how to manage it. And then that paves the way for our healing. So, why naming your anxiety is essential? Okay, so my therapist has referred to this process as affect labeling. It means putting our fears, our feelings into words, which is so hard to do because, again, those voices tell us from our abusive past or trauma, whatever we've been through, don't feel this, don't feel that. And it's siphoning the way that we are to speak about our emotions. Like, I was told that I should never feel angry, and so I would never talk about my anger. I was told as a child I should never cry, so therefore I wouldn't cry. At least I would when no one's looking. It's just damaging the words that we were told when we were children, and then we find ourselves still obeying those echoes in our heads. Research shows that naming our emotions calms the brain's amygdala. Now, the amygdala, and I pronounced it incorrectly, the amygdala is the area that's responsible for our fight or flight response. It's kind of like the smoke detector of your brain. When anxiety, fear, and stress overwhelms you, the nervous system automatically goes into survival mode. And yet by naming our experiences, such as, I feel anxious because of this, or I feel overwhelmed because that, or I'm a failure and this is why. What we're doing is that we're shifting our emotional reactivity to rational processing. And that movie, Inside Out 2, it does a perfect illustration because the main character has the voices in her head, well, I'm angry and I must do this, or I don't have any friends because I did that, or I must be liked, so therefore I'm going to do this. So talking about our feelings is the most difficult thing to do, especially if you yourself have been through any kind of trauma or therapy. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And this is the number one reason of why people don't do therapy, is because it is so hard to talk about. And you may be asking, well, Branon, I just go through anxiety, from time to time, like about my job or maybe somebody in the family, but that doesn't mean I have any trauma. Well, that could be true. Not all of us do have trauma. And if you don't, man, you are blessed. But for those of us who do have trauma, we are blessed also, because we're given tools of how to manage it. Not everybody experiences trauma in the same way, and everybody's trauma is definitely different from one person to the next. And so learning how to speak about the circumstances, the people, the events, the feelings that once controlled you, yes, my friend, it is difficult. And the reason why it's difficult is because we feel like those triggers are always there. That speed bump of emotions never gets any smaller. That wall that we seem to hit every time never breaks down. But I'm going to help in this series break down some things for you that my hope is that you can gain some tools and insights from these recordings that will assist you in your recovery of whatever that you may be going through. And yes, even if it is the day-to-day anxiety triggers. So let's go ahead and dive in deeper. Naming your anxiety doesn't erase it. Let me just say that. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a one-all to end all. But naming our anxiety gives us empowerment. Your transition from being anxious to experiencing anxiety and reinforcing the idea that your emotions are valid, yet they don't dictate your life. So I can say that I'm anxious or angry or sad, but it doesn't mean that I need to allow those emotions to control me. And that's hard, because I know what you may be thinking. At least this is what I hear from my own family members. Well, Branon, this has happened and I'll always be this way. I have dear friends that say the same thing. Well, I will always be like this, or I'm forever marked, or I can never get out of this. And that actually is not true. But what that person's saying, when they're saying things like, I'll never get over this, or I'll never be healed, what they're saying is, my emotions are controlling me and I don't know how to stop it. So, this is why we're talking about that importance of naming the trauma and also naming the narcissistic abuse that we've been through. So, for us survivors of trauma, or if it is narcissistic abuse, emotions can resemble hidden landmines. That's right, unexpected, and they're explosive. We will never know what we're going to step on, right, until we step on it. Many of us, and I can say this from my own experience, we carry these deeply rooted emotional responses from years of what? Manipulation, gaslighting, and fear. And so you can expect that as an adult, it's going to be common for you to feel guilty, even when you're setting boundaries or when you're telling that other part of yourself, no, right? I'm not going to do this, or even telling others. These feelings that you have are legitimate. They do exist. But we've also learned how to adapt and to condition our own responses. We put limits on ourselves. So by naming the full emotions and to really underscore what they really are, you really can untangle what is truly yours and versus what's been imposed on you. In other words, I feel anxious because in the past, saying no resulted in punishment. Or you don't have to stop at the thought of this guilt isn't mine, because you can now go on and say, because it stems from years of emotional control. You no longer have to stop at the wall when you say, well, I fear confrontation. But now you can say, because I was taught that my voice didn't matter. Do you see how powerful ending the sentence of those emotions, what they are, how much power that gives you? Just the label itself should give you that kind of power. It should give you that kind of control back, because labeling these emotions help you separate yourself from what you were told or how you were suppressed. You start to see that while your feelings are part of your narrative, of your story, that may be, but they don't define your identity. So the answer is no. You will not always be like this. You will not always stay this way. You are not forever marked. You are not ever unredeemable. Well, guys, I hate to end it here, but we've come to a close with Micro Matters. Follow me on this podcast by hitting the subscribe button wherever that you're getting this podcast from, so you may get the rest of this entire series, as well as future downloads of more podcasts that I put out on the Your Story Matters podcast. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to having you come back. And remember, your story matters. See you next time. Bye. Hey, survivors and friends, will you help us get the word out to bump up our algorithm for more people to see and hear these messages to help them in their journey of healing? So if you enjoy this content, will you please like and share, follow this page, especially if you're listening to this podcast and or watching this by YouTube. Please click the subscribe button, and thank you.